years ago speaking about this at a conference, work that I'm doing showing that this is a form of intimate terrorism where you have a parent who has very little power to reciprocate, they have very little power to do anything, and they're the ones whose relationship is the most damaged with their child. So for a long time, people have just talked about parental alienation as child abuse, which it is, right? It's very harmful and damaging to the child. Parents who alienate their children are not only engaging in psychological abuse, but also even physical abuse and social isolation and other types of things to harm that child and keep them away from the other parent. But it does a lot of significant damage to that child. It's also considered domestic violence because the intent of the behavior is to harm the other parent and their relationship with the child. And so many behaviors that alienators do aren't always involving the child. The child can be a weapon that's used against them, but alienating parents use a lot of the same strategies of loyalty-inducing things that people who are trying to groom children to be sexually abused use. Everything, and that's an indication that this child needs serious intervention because the damage of that long-term is really bad. But when you look to the child abuse literature, and you see children who have been abused, sexually abused. A great example would be a documentary about Michael Jackson. And Leaving Neverland was his documentary about there was two adult boys men now, but who were abused by him, allegedly, when they were younger. And they defended him tooth and nail, denied they were abused, denied all this stuff. They were his soldier, they were helping him and trying to prevent him from going to jail for abusing other boys. And it wasn't until he died and they had their own children that they came to the realization that they had been abused. But I'm a scientist and I don't work with possibilities, like what's probable? Because when you're making decisions about children, you need to go with what the evidence says. So we need to intervene and get them away from the abusive behaviors, get treatment for the person who's doing those behaviors, and repair the relationship that they've lost with the parent who is typically healthier and is a loving parent to them, and a good enough parent, a good enough healthy parent.
This is where I give you the inside perspective as an alienated child. And on today's show, and that perspective is we want to be loved by our parents. We want to know that we are accepted by our parent, by both parents. And despite what the alienator will get the child to believe that you don't need them, you don't need their love, you only need our love. We have everything that you need. And that's what was told to me by my mom and the support group that she had that I call the regime, that controlling influence of my life. They told me, we're all that you need. You don't need him. And so as communication would come, I would spit back that same message. I don't need you. Leave me alone. Deep in my heart, I felt like, don't give up on me. I wanted to know that he was out there, that he loved me, that he cared about me. That they said, I believed. I had no idea that I was being lied to, manipulated. I had no idea that I was being told and kind of railroaded into making decisions to cut my dad out of my life, because that child knows that it's not acceptable to love that person, to love that parent. It's not acceptable to want to receive a gift or a nice message or love or want to give love. They know I can't do that or I'm in big trouble. It questions my loyalty. It's going to turn things upside down. And quite honestly, I'm stuck here. I depend on these people for their love, their support, yes, their financial investment, all of the things that are controlled in life by the alienating parent and the regime is a lot to go up against for a child of any age. That's why I'm a firm believer to continually communicate with your child every single opportunity that you can, regardless of their reaction, regardless of their silence. Know that they are out there and they need you and they can't say it. And that is the inside perspective that I bring you here today as a former alienated child who reunited with my dad.
I think now we're reaching a point where we're starting to recognise that a child who says vehemently, I'm not going to see a parent after family separation, is a child that's waving a red flag.
This is criminal behavior. The alienator is assaulting the child's memory, feelings, thinking, relationship with the parent. Assault is a crime.
So when you see a child who's rejecting one parent, especially strongly, and you see a child, the same child, is strongly aligned with the other parent, probably that's an alienated child, not an estranged one.
We have a lot of research about how profoundly dysfunctional and unstable an alienating parent is. Let's face it, a normal parent will not try to undermine the relationship between the child and the other parent. A normal parent appreciates that the child has a need for the other parent. And when the alienating parent can't appreciate that, they lack empathy, for one thing.
For a child to reject a parent is not just about the dreadfulness of murdering a parent who is still alive and saying, I no longer want to have you in my consciousness. It's about the way that that child has murdered part of themselves and has then been forced to live with it. And it's only when that child comes into their young adulthood that perhaps the gravest consequences of what they've been forced to do really starts to come to light.
This is evidence-based science. You don't just get to make it up. I think it's important, as an aside, to distinguish between science and a belief system, or science and ideology, or science and speculation.
And if you're looking for alienation and even other kinds of domestic violence, you have to look at patterns over time. Because abusive parents they use coercive control, they use ways to dominate the other person, and that you have to look deep and you have to look at it over an extended period of time.
If the professional doesn't have specialty level pattern recognition, or better yet, subspecialty level pattern recognition, you're liable to make a lot of mistakes and miss the important patterns.
Well, actions speak louder than words. I say immediately, you have to be able to reason backwards. When the alienating parent shows genuine support for the relationship between the other parent and child, you know it in how the child behaves. They will accept the other parent like this, like a light switch.
If you're using intuition, even when you shouldn't, then you tend to have great confidence in your incorrect conclusions. That's almost true by definition. It feels right. So no matter how wrong you are, if it was intuitive thinking, it feels right, and I'll repeat the catchy phrase, consequently, they tend to have great confidence in their incorrect conclusions, and that's a huge problem.
There's a kind of a perception that both parents must be contributing to the problem for this child to be rejecting them. You know, one parent must be doing something bad, and then the other parents, and they're both acting badly towards each other. And in my experience interviewing and talking to targeted parents and researching them, that a lot of them are really helpless. They have almost no power or control over what's happening in their lives, in their children's lives. The alienating parent really controls everything. They control access and communication to their child. Anything that that parent will say to the child is interpreted by that child as negative and hostile towards the other parent who they're trying to protect. So my experience was that it's impossible for this person to reciprocate when you actually see the dynamics in these families.
What's going on here is the alienating parent tends to be a master manipulator, often an accomplished liar, brilliant at managing impressions, and so on, and is the aggressor who's winning. The other parent is a trauma victim.
So rather than sort of these children blossoming, they're kind of wilting under the care of the favored parent, and that's just profoundly frustrating, and that word doesn't just really begin to capture how painful it is for the targeted parent to go through that.
For one thing, it requires certain types of thinking that are not commonly taught to professionals. Some advanced medical concepts, for example, reasoning backwards from effect to cause, and conditional probability, which is the probability of one thing given another thing, or the probability of one event given that another event has already occurred. So not to get too technical, that's the first point. It requires special expertise, and that expertise is not necessarily common among the people who deal with these cases.
Typically, alienating parents are what we call narcissistically vulnerable. They feel very threatened when part of their identity is being diminished within the dissolution of the marriage, so they externalize the blame and project it outward towards the targeted parent. And the children get involved in that, and they're caught in the middle.
Usually when you're dealing with alienation, it's one of three types, or a combination: borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, or some type of a sociopathic personality disorder.
And my most recent paper, we found that in the US, it's about 22 million adults are the victims of parental alienating behaviors, and they are not reciprocating the behaviors. So they are the primary targets of these behaviors.
Is rejection of a parent serious for a child? It absolutely is. To reject a parent is a very unnatural thing for a child to do. We are born helpless into the world, and we attach to our primary caregivers as a way of avoiding being abandoned. And our biggest fear is that we will be abandoned. And unfortunately, what happens to children in these circumstances is that they are forced to reject a parent against their natural way of being in the world, and then they're forced to live with and suffer the consequences of that, which are very, very deep, and they're long-lasting. And one of the problems about alienation is that we don't readily see the impact on the child in the here and now. What we see is the impact of the child much further down the line.
The non-specialist in alienation will say, oh, this is a relationship problem between a child and a parent. I know how to treat that. Well, there's a world of difference if the child is rejecting the parent for legitimate protective reasons, or it's a result of a brainwashing.
When non-specialists see it, what you see is a child who seems close to mom or close to dad. They can sit in an interview and the parent is rubbing the child's back and holding hands, and the child tells you how great the parent is and how bad the other parent is. Anyone who doesn't have specialty level expertise is liable to leave that interview thinking, what a great relationship. So I'll repeat the phrase, non-specialists almost always, and I don't use a term like that lightly, almost always mistake pathological enmeshment for healthy bonding.
When the alienating parent alleges alienation, you have an obligation then to say, let me explore this, and is this my area of expertise? And if I don't know the 8 manifestations, and I don't know the 17 alienating strategies, and I haven't taken a CEU course, and I've never been to a conference like PASG, and I don't collaborate with one single known expert in the field on alienation, this is outside my area of expertise. I have an obligation to do one of two things. Get an expert to supervise me, or say, you know what, I'm in way over my head, I have to pass this case, I cannot treat it.
Targeted parents are living in an unending grief.
The alienator presents with the 4 C's. He or she is cool, calm, convincing, calm, charming, and convincing. By contrast, the alienated parent, the targeted parent, has the 4 A's. He or she is anxious, agitated, angry, or afraid. And if you don't know to look for that pattern, and you interview each one, you think you've got it all figured out after the first interview.
It is a malicious activity, and there are malicious people who do things. It's a little bit like bank robbery. You know, no matter what you do, there's still going to be bank robbery.
In other cases, we work with parents for whom they are very much a victim of their own their own history. So an example of that would be perhaps a mother who had been abused in her own childhood. And because that was never dealt with, it's remained unresolved. And in the drama of the family separation, that can come spilling out into the here and now. And typically what happens there is that they will project their unresolved trauma onto the child. This is something that needs to be stopped. It needs to be prevented, not least because if it's not, the danger is that it gets passed down the generation to that child's own children and even beyond that. And if you've got a parent who demonstrates, who shows, who through their behaviour signals to the child that it's not acceptable for the child to have a relationship with the other parent, then the child will respond to that because their greatest anxiety is that that parent will become emotionally unavailable to them. And that's what we're looking for. Why has this child become bound to one parent? We look at this at the Family Separation Clinic first and foremost as a child protection issue. Parental alienation, in my view, is child abuse. Sometimes it's child abuse that's inadvertent. A parent is simply incapable of holding back their own psychopathology. Very often these are transgenerational transmissions of trauma that come crashing out in the here and now. But whether this is deliberate and conscious or whether it's unconscious, the child is still at risk of the same kinds of harm. And therefore we need to think of it in terms of it as child abuse and child protection. If you don't treat a child that's been alienated, a child who's been pathologically split, the real danger for that child is that they will go through the rest of their lives with a propensity to split, that all of their life will be one of black and white rather than shades of grey. Now we see this very often when we work with adult children who were alienated, demonstrating that there is a very, very serious problem. These cases wouldn't be treated as custody and visitation cases, they'd be treated as child protection cases, because what we know is when a child is beginning to reject a relationship with an attachment figure, there is something very serious at the heart of this, and that it needs to be dealt with very swiftly. We don't have, or the child doesn't have the time for this to be spun out over many, many years of going back to court and trying to resolve it through parents being told they need to get along better, mediation and all those kinds of things. I think what you need is a thorough investigation into what's going on as early as possible in the case, and then the proper remedial action taken. Either the behaviours of the aligned parent are constrained, but if that's not possible, then the child needs to be removed from the source of the harm, just in exactly the same way that we would do if a child was being physically harmed or sexually abused or neglected. But he has power over the other. And the first thing that you need to do is to neutralise that power. And the only way that you can do that successfully is to bring in a court intervention that stops that parent doing what they're doing. So what you're doing is you are using the legal framework to put in place the conditions that allow you then to begin to do the therapeutic work. If you attempt to do this work as a therapist without having that framework in place, then not only is it unlikely to work, but you're actually likely to make it a whole lot worse for the child. And therefore it's critical that you get the case management right and you bring the legal constraint in, and then you do the therapeutic work within that space.